it is our mission to support interdisciplinary research and public programs that advance knowledge about human experience in social, historical, and cultural contexts. My name is Susan Derwin, and I'm the IHC Director, and I want to remind you to follow us at IHC UCSB. Thank you for listening to the station break. Now, it is my great pleasure to welcome our speaker today, Scott Ferguson, to the IHC to give a talk. And I must say that this is something of a homecoming, since Scott is, or was, I should say, feels like now since our discussion that you still are, but you're not, an undergraduate at UCSB, where he earned his BA in Film Studies with a minor in Global Peace and Security. He went on to get his PhD in Rhetoric and Film Studies from UC Berkeley, and presently he's an assistant professor in the department.
Associate.
Just newly tenured associate professor. Change your website. Associate professor in the Department of Humanities and Cultural Studies at the University of South Florida, and he is also a research scholar at the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. Most of you know this institute by its earlier name, which is the Binziger Institute for Sustainable Prosperity, right? Of course. All right.
Household name.
Household name, yes. Now, Scott's current research and pedagogy focus on aesthetic theory, the history of digital animation and visual effects, especially in the age of the Hollywood blockbuster. He's also interested in essayistic writing across media platforms, as well as modern monetary theory and critiques of neoliberalism. He has published in journals such as Screen, Boundary 2 Online, Qui Parle, and Radical Political Economy. And his book, Declarations of Dependence, Money, Aesthetics, and the Politics of Care, appeared, I believe, in July with the University of Nebraska Press. So I want to say that it's obvious that the IHC Public Events Series, this year's series, Social Securities, is taking place at a time when insecurity, precarity, and destruction of the social fabric are predominating in our world. But in putting together this year's schedule of speakers, we wanted to invite scholars and artists who are working within and thinking about social relations in terms of their constructive potentialities. And I think you will see that Scott Ferguson is one such thinker, and I do want to thank my colleague, Bhaskar Sarkar, for bringing Scott's work to my attention. And I would ask all of you now to please join me in welcoming Scott to give his talk, Money is No Object, Aesthetics, Abstraction, and the Politics of Care. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I would like to extend my gratitude to Susan Derwin for the invitation to speak at UCSB's Interdisciplinary Humanities Center. I equally wish to thank Erin Nerstedt for assisting with travel and accommodations, and Bhaskar Sarkar for recommending me for this year's exciting IHC speaker series, Social Securities. I'm honored to have the opportunity to share my recent scholarship with you at IHC. I'm also delighted to be back at UCSB, where, as it was announced, I earned my BA in Film Studies and a Global Peace and Security minor nearly 20 years ago. My ongoing research focuses on relations between political economy and aesthetics in Western modernity. Echoing the concerns of this year's IHC speaker series, problems of social security figure centrally in my work. In particular, I trouble the perceived contingent material foundation of social security in the modern West by critiquing visual simulations of bodily contact and material gravity, from Renaissance painting to the new Hollywood blockbuster. I problematize Western modernity's reduction of political and economic relationality to embodied social power. Instead, I install the quandary of far-flung social and ecological dependence at the crux of political economy and ask how visual media variously answer this quandary's riddling charge. I insist that care is a genuinely political category, a macro-scale problematic that links interdependent creatures and environments simultaneously at a distance. What is more, I claim that care obliges us to reckon with centers of collective belonging, contra the decentralizing or Copernican impulses that guide the modern West's variously immanent metaphysics. Perhaps more surprising, I locate care's enigmatic center in the very last place a leftist scholar reared on critical theory, such as myself, would imagine finding it: the money relation. Rather than treat money as a private medium for decentralized exchanges, I understand monetary abstraction as a boundless public center. In this, I follow the contemporary heterodox school of political economy known as modern monetary theory, or MMT for short. Developing MMT's insights, I disclose the emphatically abstract bases of embodied social security. I set the historically fraught modern relationship between political economy and aesthetics on more capacious premises. And I inaugurate a new practice of critical theory, which seeks to actualize money's curative potentials in a sensuous here and now. Such are the principal arguments and stakes of my recently published book, Declarations of Dependence, Money, Aesthetics, and the Politics of Care. In what follows, I share the book's primary provocations in an effort to transcend the deadlocks that haunt aesthetic praxis from the Renaissance to the neoliberal period, while making critical theory freshly answerable to politics. Before I do so, however, I want to flesh out MMT's counterintuitive yet important intervention. Whereas modernity's dominant liberal political economy construes money as a private, finite, and decentralized exchange instrument that can never seem to be everywhere it is needed, MMT conceives money as an unlimited public utility, which harbors untold capacities for political inclusion and sustainable prosperity. According to MMT's state-based or chartalist theory, money does not bubble up from spontaneous barter-like exchanges at the fringes of society, as orthodox yarns about money's origins presuppose. Money is rather a fiscal project, promulgated by centralized governments from ancient Sumer to medieval China to the contemporary United States. As a fiscal infrastructure, money organizes finite material production through an abstract government writing instrument that no currency-issuing polity can be said to lack. On MMT's argument, money arises whenever a governing institution or stakeholder at the center of a community imposes obligations on the wider collective in the form of taxes, including fees, fines, and tithes. Denominated in a unit, the stakeholder sets and enforces such obligations form the backbone of all economic activity, public and private alike. The tax obligation also renders money a thoroughly political institution, subject to no special economic laws of motion beyond the challenges of collective governance, contestation, and know-how. That is, money hinges on what MMT describes as a vertical rapport between stakeholder and community. Only secondarily does this rapport make possible horizontal transactions, which liberal modernity mistakenly identifies as exchange and often metaphorizes as so many decentered flows. As a consequence, MMT surmises, a currency-issuing polity can forever afford to guarantee persons employment and involvement, access and care, regardless of the going quantity of federal tax receipts or bond sales. So long as fiscal expenditures activate meaningful and productive endeavors, public spending can usher forth a robust, ecologically sensitive, and socially inclusive system of production and distribution without causing deleterious inflation. In MMT's eyes, to insist a currency-issuing government needs tax or bond revenues in order to fund urgent social projects is akin to the absurdity of requiring umpires to commandeer runs from previously earned high-scoring teams before redistributing them to underperforming ball clubs on game day. This means that struggles over fiscal policy ought to be radically decoupled from debates about the taxation of wealth. Tax wealth accumulation, because no private persons or obligations should wield disproportionate economic power and political influence, says MMT, not because government can allegedly run out of a money unit it alone supplies. MMT economist Stephanie Kelton encapsulates her school's singular approach to political economy with an elegant maxim: money is no object. By this, Kelton means something akin to Karl Marx's off-sided language in The Poverty of Philosophy. Money is not a thing, it is a social relation. Still, Kelton goes further. A deliberate pun, her quip puts a dialectical twist on Marx, who in a footnote to Capital Volume 1 dismisses the chartless tradition to which MMT belongs as sycophantic service to crowned heads. When it comes to the public purse, Kelton's maxim declares, politics, not affordability, is the only serious constraint. With this, MMT not only liberates the treasury for common use and disputation, but also subtly severs money's topology from what Marxists often call the mediated immediacy of the cash nexus. Whereas Marx's imminent critique of liberalism lambasts the cash nexus for transmuting directly intersubjective relations into alienating relations between fungible things, MMT's argument for money's irreducibly wide and inalienable fiscal architecture, reveals Marxism's insistence upon intersubjective objectification to be misplaced and misleading. In contrast, MMT discloses radical and realizable possibilities for social and ecological transformation by transforming money from the apparent root of all evil into the most capacious revolutionary weapon currently within reach. In Declarations of Dependence, I take MMT's chartalist view of money as provocation to reground critical theory's traditionally Marxist approach to modern culture and aesthetics. The book's key theses unfold across four main body chapters. Chapter 1 is titled Transcending the Aesthetic. In it, I sketch a genealogy of MMT and dialogue with Marxist critiques of political economy. Next, I read the now exhausted dialectical opposition between money and aesthetics as a debilitating symptom of the liberal conception of money. In place of this dead-end dialectic, I draw the aesthetic's historical dedication to sensory enrichment and social expansion, entirely within money's commodious fiscal structure, thereby redeeming money and aesthetics alike. Chapter 2, Declarations of Dependence, risks the surprising thesis that money constitutes the center of collective caretaking in modernity. From here, I develop what I call a politics of care, which exposes overthought problems of freedom and power to largely repressed riddles of human dependence and collective maintenance. Along the way, I theorize what I call money's proto-aesthetic field, defined as the shared sensory floor that monetary governance conditions. Finally, I outline a symptomology of care by drawing on the object relations school of psychoanalysis. Whereas Oedipal logics root symptoms and contradictions between desirous subjects and fraternal laws, the object relations school permits us to read cultural artifacts as cryptic signs of collective care's historical contradictions and failures, while leveraging the resulting insights toward political demands. My third chapter contests conventional accounts of the rise of money in the modern West that foreground the allegedly spontaneous emergence of merchant and banking activity in the Italian peninsula during the High Middle Ages. Titled Medium Congruentissimum, or Communal Medium, Chapter 3 traces money's European ascent, modern European ascent, back to the late medieval papacy's broad-scale system of taxation. Moreover, I track a well-known concurrent shift in Western metaphysics that first revealed, then concealed, money's topology and capacities, replacing the broad, centralizing, and decidedly abstract dependencies avowed by the medieval scholasticism of Thomas Aquinas. Franciscan theologians and humanist writers in the 14th and 15th centuries turned to an immediate metaphysics of thisness, or in the Latin name, haechiety. Deeming the church's voluminous infrastructure of mediation unnecessary, Franciscans and humanists reduced being in general, and money in particular, to a contingent and ever-alienable thisness, setting the groundwork for the rise of liberal philosophy and political economy a few hundred years later. Chapter 4, Allegories of the Aesthetic, uncovers what I see as the repressed historical secret of the modern aesthetic project within what I call Western modernity's gravitropic visuality. Born with perspectival painting during the Florentine Renaissance, the modern era's gravitropic visuality conjures impressions of spectatorial immersion, contiguous movement, and a universally enjoyed material gravity. In doing so, I claim, it represses inscriptions' abstract and paratactic qualities, while expressing a wish to redeem an expansive primordial thisness, which later British sentimentalists and German idealists will make the basis of the modern aesthetic project. In time, various modernisms and avant-gardes challenge this gravitropic visuality, yet it returns with a vengeance in the neoliberal era, with the rise of new Hollywood blockbusters and AAA video games. Following a symptomatic analysis of such hyper-Newtonian media, as I term them, I conclude with an exhortation to divest modern sensory experience of visual culture's gravitropic assurances and to embrace abstraction across monetary and aesthetic realms. In the remainder of my time, I want to highlight and expand some of my book's interlocking claims over the course of 4 sections. First, I clarify what I mean by a politics of care, developing its significance for imagining money as the abstract source of social security. Second, I explicate, and those other things, the constrictive modern metaphysics of haechiety that on my reading so constrain care in Western modernity. Third, I turn a critical eye toward modernity's gravitropic visuality in order to rethink the historically vexed problem of aesthetic abstraction. Fourth, I consider abstraction's present political and aesthetic stakes by looking closely at Disney's hyper-Newtonian digital blockbuster, Big Hero 6. Part 1, Care, a room of her own. In my book, I propose that critical theory ought to shift its attention from questions of power to matters of care. In opposition to Western political philosophy since at least Machiavelli, I argue that care is inextricable from, but irreducible to power, and that the political is the very site of this entanglement. By care, I mean something different from the dominant modern understanding of this term, as an altruistic being for others that one willfully adopts or refuses. I recuperate care's original and richer meaning as an anxious and inescapable social obligation, as well as a form of collective cultivation and uplift. Always at issue and never self-evident, care names the enigmatic locus of interdependence toward which every being, so to speak, leans. On one hand, care is an unshirkable burden or charge, which tethers each person to the center of the social totality, from the widest to the most localized scales. In this way, care involves everyone within a polity in a manner that is prior to decisions of individual consent or moral activity. On the other hand, care constitutes an underdetermined activity of cultivating and maintaining a polity. Care, in other words, composes a mysterious centralizing comportment where a radical sense of implication means radical transformability, and where the social order as a whole hangs in the balance. The alternative genealogy of care upon which I draw is traceable to the so-called myth of care, or cura, attributed to 1st century Roman poet Gaius Julius Hyginus. Hyginus' parable is brief, so I quote it in full. Once, when Care was crossing a river, she saw some clay. She thoughtfully took up a piece and began to shape it. While she was meditating on what she made, Jupiter came by. Care asked him to give it spirit, and this he gladly granted. But when she wanted to name, when she wanted her name to be bestowed upon it, he forbade this and demanded that it be given his name instead. While Care and Jupiter were disputing, Earth arose and desired that her own name be conferred on the creature, since she had furnished it with part of her body. They asked Saturn to be their arbiter, and he made the following decision, which seemed a just one. Since you, Jupiter, have given it spirit, you shall receive that spirit at its death. And since you, Earth, have given its body, you shall receive its body. But since Care first shaped this creature, you shall receive its body. You shall possess it as long as it lives. And because there is now a dispute among you as to its name, let it be called Homo, for it is made out of humus, or earth. Historically, Hyginus' parable has been interpreted as a gynophilic countermyth to the patriarchal origin stories that dominate the Western tradition. Such readings note the parable's affirmation of Cura's feminine perspective as opposed to the perspective of the masculine gods. Her irresolvable predicaments, moreover, are central to the myth's conception of the human. As theologian Warren T. Wright explains, the lifelong care of the human would be undertaken by Cura. It entails both an earthly bodily element that is pulled down to the ground, worry, a spirit element that strives upward to the divine. The positive side of care dominates this story, for the primordial role of care is to hold the human together in wholeness while cherishing it. Caught in the stream of life, Kara is pitched between worldly burdens and spiritual uplift as she strives to shape the living figure who becomes her charge. Still, there remains a less remarked upon, yet no less significant dimension of the Cura fable. It pertains to the myth's treatment of care's signification and locatability. For feminist philosophers Jean Gray-Beal, probably Jean Gray-Beal, and Katrin Frosa, Hyginus' story may avow the importance of Cura's feminine struggle, but it also dramatizes the patriarchal repression of Care's name and locus. Father Saturn's apparently just arbitration allows Cura to bear the human being throughout its life, but when it comes time to designate and locate this creation, he names it Homo after humus, meaning mere ground or dirt. This designation reduces Homo's activity to Earth's material particularity, and renders Kira's thoughtful mediation of matter and meaning, heaven and earth, to something Frederick Jameson might call a vanishing mediator. Of course, for Jameson, this term marks a medium's sublation of antagonistic terms that will fade away when no longer needed. In this case, however, care remains tasked with holding everything together while lacking a proper designation or a place to call her own. Homo may incidentally note Earth's role in supporting its spiritual quest for meaning, yet as Hyginus's fable indicates, the creature will have little to no awareness of the pervasive medium responsible for these strivings and the gatherings of matter and meaning upon which they depend. For this reason, care persists only as a minor, though still significant thread in the history of Western thought. Perhaps most important is Martin Heidegger's early 20th century effort to develop an expansive notion of care for phenomenology, and later for what he designates as a center that has gone unheard. In Declarations of Dependence, I think Heidegger's more or less apolitical, unheard of center, alongside Judith Butler's recent political writings. In texts such as Notes Toward a Performative Theory of Assembly, Butler not only theorizes the political as a center toward which everyone variously inclines, but also theorizes performative political assemblies as demonstrative gatherings organized around dependence. From Occupy Wall Street to Black Lives Matter to the Sunshine Movement, performative assemblies politicize collective vulnerability and suffering, quote, delivering bodily demands for a more livable set of economic, social, and political conditions. I call such demands declarations of dependence and have named my book after their far-reaching, situated demonstrations. Part 2, Modern Metaphysics, the Big Squeeze. My contention in Declarations of Dependence is that while care's center ontologically precedes the money relation, money becomes the dominant means for politically organizing the problem of social dependence during the modern period. The calamity of Western modernity, however, is that its hegemonic liberal money form is predicated upon an impoverished metaphysics of thisness, which arises centuries earlier in Franciscan theology and humanist methods, and forecloses care's centralizing locus and wide mediating breadth. To understand this historical break in Western metaphysics, one must comprehend Thomas Aquinas' synthesis of the scholastic tradition from which Heichiati thinking departs. Writing during the great political and economic expansion of the High Middle Ages, Thomas argued that being takes the shape of a centralizing, inalienable, and interdependent cascade. While no doubt reliant upon the contiguous comings and goings of individual creatures and things, this boundless cascade realizes the broad labor of creation all at once via its entire interconnected infrastructure. Irreducible to the rigidly hierarchical great chain of being, as it was later characterized, Thomas's metaphysics sought to make sense of the late medieval period's ballooning political economy and diverse converging cultures. This metaphysics is perhaps best emblematized by the inexhaustible transubstantiation of the Eucharist on disparate altars at once. And I should just say, like MMT, Thomas is not going to say that you can run out of body of Christ, basically. Yet it also subtends Thomas's curious theory of angelic movement, a non-locomotive transfer from one location to another that permits instant passage without coursing through intervening space. Still more miraculous from a modern perspective are late medieval chartalist conceptions of a boundless fiscal apparatus, what jurists from Bracton to Accursius referred to as fictus Fiscus Sanctissimus, or the Most Holy Fisk. During the 14th and 15th centuries, late medieval Europe entered a long and painful twilight, beset by countless political, economic, and environmental crises. Responding to these crises, Franciscan theologians such as Duns Scotus and William of Ockham, and humanists from Petrarch to Erasmus, challenged the Thomistic synthesis with a new metaphysics and a recognizably modern social topology. This metaphysical topos decentered Thomism's boundless cascade, reconstituting the Christian God as an absolute and immediately willing power in the world. In so doing, the Franciscans and humanists variously contracted dependency's wide causal breadth into a contiguous and ultimately alienable thisness, which Scotus famously dubbed haikaitas, or haikaitai. Increasingly, this new modern topology of being reduced causality to efficient relations, while deeming anything like concurrent mediation at a distance either unnecessary, artificial, or downright impossible. Over time, the topos of haikaitai became the unquestioned metaphysical backdrop for an ascendant modernity, lending direction, rhythm, and significance to everything from political economy to aesthetics. It enabled influential Franciscans and humanists to reject Thomist visions of an incorruptible holy fisk and to re-envision money as an alienable medium of exchange. It spurred Renaissance visual and literary culture to exchange Gothic and Byzantine abstraction for figurations of immediate sensuous embodiment and a passionate material gravitas. At the same time, growing metaphysical commitment to an immediate willing potency saw political philosophers from Machiavelli to Hobbes think the polis primarily in terms of power, subordinating care's vast scaffolding to the status of a weak, naive, and often feminized supplement. The key historical player in this process is, of course, Reformed Christianity. Staging a tax revolt against papal tithing, Reformed Christianity jettisoned the Church's feminized mediations, which were frequently symbolized by the Virgin Mary, while promising a more intimate relationship with a decentered divine Father via an intensified personal faith and direct access to biblical interpretation. Justifying a period of destructive religious wars, Reformed Christianity precipitated the famous Westphalian settlement, which in turn birthed the modern system of fiscally strapped nation-states. Finally, modernity's haikaitai metaphysics cast the mold for an emergent philosophy and practice of the aesthetic. Set against monetary exchange while mirroring its dreams of an enriching proximity, the aesthetic aimed to cure the inadequacies of liberalism's alienating and destructive money form. Only it sought to save the bourgeoisie by redeeming the same poisonous metaphysics that conditions liberal money's deficiencies. Further, there, the aesthetic there. With the foregoing history of money and metaphysics in view, my book reposes critical theory's central historical problem, abstraction. For critical theorists, the problem of modernity is to be found in the inscrutable relationship between monetary abstraction and the production of sensuous life as a whole. Generally speaking, forays into this problem rest on two interrelated insights. The first has been put well by Frederick Jameson. Money is what he calls, quote, the fundamental source of all abstraction in modern life. The second claim concerns monetary abstraction's central influence on representation writ large. In T.J. Clark's words, quote, money is the root form of representation in modern society. In Declarations of Dependence, I affirm both insights, yet part ways with critical theory's unquestioned ontological attachments to an originary thisness. Such attachments forsake abstraction's potential at the outset by presuming monetary abstraction inevitably detracts something from embodied sociality, and that social representations governed by money will be stamped with exploitation and carelessness. The best critical theory reads cultural artifacts as genuine socio-historical riddles, refusing vulgar reductions and determinations. In my book, I place abstraction at the heart of such inquiries, but reformulate critical theory's project through an approach to MMT that is indebted to Thomas Aquinas. Upon these premises, I diagnosed the modern aesthetic project as a symptom of liberal modernity's restless enchantment by haetiety. I disclosed the unconscious wish that drives the aesthetic project through a fresh reading of modernity's hegemonic, gravitropic visuality. Modern European visual culture is born with perspectival painting in the Florentine Renaissance. Long recognized for its pursuit of mimetic likeness, or the so-called imitatio naturae principle, Quattrocento perspective is said to break with the abstract and expressly paratactic pictorial strategies of Gothic and Byzantine visual culture. According to its adherents, Quattrocento painting is supposed to derive its pictorial structure from nature itself, with parallel lines that converge at one or more vanishing points. It promises to open a transparent window onto embodied relations in the real world. Suspicious of the viewpoint perspectivalism produces, Marxist aestheticians have understood its links to the possessive individualism of modern life. Such arguments follow Marxist critiques of money, in the sense that they accuse an abstract form of naturalizing social domination and economic alienation. The abstractions of Renaissance perspective carve out a disembodied and idealized position of mastery for the viewing subject, to whom they extend an illusion of transparency. The result allows the bourgeois subject to imagine holding dominion over the world and possessing myriad objects. As in Marxist critique of money, however, the dubious mathematics of Renaissance perspective in fact dominate the subject they establish and alienate its illusory viewpoint from connections to the immediate social and material world. On my reading, Renaissance perspective is neither natural nor properly abstract. And the historical significance of Quattrocento pictorialism has little to do with oppositions between transparency and opacity. Instead, I argue, Renaissance perspective constructs a gravitropic phenomenology that aims to physically embrace viewer and viewed in a relationship of material propinquity. No matter how stable or unstable, transparent or opaque that relation may appear. The phenomenology places the spectatorial body in the here and now of a geometrically projected scene. More important, it physically anchors the embodied viewpoint in a distributed array of light and heavy figures, suggesting a world held together by invisible forces of gravitational attraction. This overlooked phenomenology, I submit, harbors a gravitropic wish to secure social mediation at a distance. In the face of money's alienable viscous, gravitropic visuality cradles the sensorium in its all-encompassing material grasp. It mediates social relations between near and far, seen and unseen, and does so in a manner that abjures what humanist Lorenzo Valla dismissed as the weightless ravings of Thomist scholasticism, not to mention the dizzying ethereality of Gothic tracery. With this, Renaissance perspective's gravitropic phenomenology seeks to redeem the anemic haetiety that organizes the wildly unstable money relation that emerged from the Florentine Republic. By rendering haetiety a totalizing and all-inclusive relation of material propinquity, Quattrocento perspective at once reduces relationality to contiguity and imagines that this contiguity is capable of holding the social totality together. There, says the picture, there's still a there, even as all that is solid seems to melt into air. In the centuries that followed the Florentine Renaissance, its passionate visual gravity became the underlying topos of modern consciousness. Renaissance-era conflicts between money and morality slowly transmuted into a recognizably modern dialectic between the domain of money and that of the aesthetic. As scholar Michael Friedman has demonstrated, Immanuel Kant's third critique refashioned Newton's theory of universal gravitation to imagine the aesthetic as a disinterested antidote to interested commerce and a distinctly modern site of sensuous and communal salvation. It is true that Kant's transcendental thinking eschews the substantive forces proffered by Newton. Kant makes no mention of Newton's strange gravitational theology, characterized as, quote, an emanative effect of God and an affection of every kind of being, end quote. Throughout his later writings, however, Friedman shows that Kant saw a deep analogy between the community of all rational beings in a moral realm of ends and the thoroughgoing community affected by all material bodies in the universe by universal gravitation. This brings me to one of my book's main theses. The aesthetic project constitutes a modern gravitropic form of care, first developed by gravitropic visual culture. But it is tragically incapable of fulfilling its historical charge of securing the social and material order of things. Rejecting divine mediation at a distance, modernity adopts the aesthetic's gravitropic embrace, stretching heterodoxy to its maximal capacity in hopes of saving the social totality. The aesthetic thus signals modern care's absolute limit. A vital and by now inextricable feature of modern life, the aesthetic project continuously contributes to political and economic domains. In making it a site of collective salvation, however, one turns from money's limitless center and obliges the aesthetic to contribute far more than it can afford. Contemporary aestheticians know the hopelessness of this charge, but do not perceive its conditions. Melancholically renouncing the dialectic between money and aesthetics, they fail to detect the problematic history of this relation or imagine a genuinely curative way forward. To transcend this impasse, critical theorists after MMT must discern and treat its entrenched symptomology. Such symptoms include Marxism's own affection for gravitropic assurances, in addition to the immersive Baroque physics of new Hollywood blockbusters and AAA video games. As I argue in my fourth and final chapter, such hyper-Newtonian media announce both the collapse and exhaustion of the historical dialectic between money and aesthetics in the neoliberal era by compulsively making gravitropic salvation into a global commercial spectacle. These immersive thrill rides collapse the difference between abstraction and physics, pronouncing the death of the aesthetic while rendering the phenomenological structure of money's boundless center illegible. Still, it is not enough to denounce hyper-Newtonian media. Instead, we must approach their gravitropic suffering and caretaking as declarations of dependence, impassioned demands for a more expansive, diverse, and secure collectivity in the face of neoliberalism's debilitating reduction of monetary and aesthetic abstraction to an unanswerable global flux. My fourth and last part, wither abstraction, are you satisfied with your care? I conclude with Disney's computer-animated feature Big Hero 6, which raises a question that cuts to the core of neoliberal media and the fate of the aesthetic project. Each time the film's healthcare robot, Baymax, performs treatment, he asks, "Are you satisfied with your care?" According to his programming, only a yes will suffice. For a media form that doles out lessons to its consumers, this forced consent seems cunningly reflexive and ideologically pernicious. Throughout Big Hero 6, Baymax's programming is played for humor. At the film's climax, however, his query becomes the source of a fatal and seemingly impossible decision. Free-floating in an alternative dimension of ponderous volumetric space, Baymax is damaged and can no longer use the majority of his powers. Thus stranded, he and protagonist Hero, with an I, reach out to stabilize each other's movements. Conjuring countless similar arrangements in hyper-Newtonian media, their interlocked grip recalls the computer-generated hand created by Pixar founder and president of Walt Disney Studios, Ed Catmull, in 1972. A wire construction, later featured in the 1976 film Future World, Catmull's hand pioneered the Renaissance-style polygon projection techniques that have grounded more than 4 decades of gravitropic computer graphics. Hero in Baymax also returns to the very beginning of modernity's gravitropic visuality, recalling the figure of Francis reaching toward God's hand in Giotto's St. Francis Renounces His Father. The pair evoke above all Michelangelo's creation of Adam, wherein God's outstretched finger expresses the narrow and contingent foundations of human existence. It's also the poster of E.T. I mean, it's in every single blockbuster. There's one of these figurations. As they drift together, and without recourse, Baymax offers to use his fist, an operational rocket, to propel Hero back to safety. Because every hyper-Newtonian action has its reaction, however, this means Baymax will be pushed deeper into the ether, where he will perish alone. Committed to this strategy, Baymax must nonetheless ask his routine question and receive an affirmative answer. When he asks Hero, "Are you satisfied with your care?" the boy struggles to discover a way to save them both. "There is no time," Baymax retorts, before reiterating his question. Rebuffed again, Baymax summons the origins of the blockbuster by way of Obi-Wan Kenobi. Hero, he pledges, "I will always be with you," to which the boy weepingly replies after another embrace, "I am satisfied with my care." Riding Baymax's fist to safety, Hero's caretaker drifts toward the image's vanishing point and will eventually be swallowed up by its crushingly finite schema of the infinite. Are we satisfied with our care? Yes or no? Such is the choice we face when it comes to the modern dialectic between money and aesthetics. The conclusion to Big Hero 6 offers the neoliberal path forward. Baymax returns to Hero in the form of a memory chip. Clenched in the rocket fist, he rode to safety. A token of Hechiety, the chip is a compact vehicle for storing abstract information that attains its place and significance against a gravitropic background. Delimited in space and contingent with respect to time, the memory chip permits Hero to give back to Baymax and thereby help him keep his caretaker's promise. As with the aesthetic project as a whole, Big Hero 6 answers neoliberalism's zero-sum logic with a caring and mutually reciprocating Hechiety. From MMT's vantage, of course, this care takes the very form of neoliberalism, and as such represents a historical road to nowhere. Therefore, to retain the force of the aesthetic for our collective existence, we must refuse neoliberalism's false choice and unfold both money and aesthetics into abstraction's boundless and inalienable embrace. Thank you.
I'm genuinely perplexed about your use of examples, so I hope you don't mind if I ask you a couple questions.
They're supposed to be. They're supposed to be wildly defamiliarized.
Well, what is the relationship between your examples and your argument, I guess would be the question. So, I mean, why Rubens and Picasso, for instance, are you making an argument there about the production of symbolic value and cultural value? Except at the end, there was no reference to the content of the paintings. And so I'm wondering, how should we read your use of examples, the particular art canon, and then what is the relationship between, let's say, Rubens and Big Hero 6? And, is there something happening with capital A art in relation to the aesthetic? And if you maybe just...
Absolutely. Okay. Yeah, so there's a lot. A lot of this is... Oh, I could just stand here. Where did we get? My use of examples. Yes, I'm mostly not interested in content, representational content, especially in this context, although I do get into it a little bit with Big Hero 6, because I'm precisely interested in form, and I'm interested in the different historical regimes and moments of form. And I'm interested in thinking about visual forms that embrace abstraction, as I'm understanding it, and visual forms that contract abstraction, such that they are preoccupied with immediate material particularity and immersion that then extends and makes essentially the entire horizon feel like an extrapolation of that sensuous continuum. So for me, the examples are important first and foremost because they represent different forms that variously embrace and repress abstraction. Then on top of that, I would say I'm making, I think, less profound but just sort of subtle, more content-based suggestive arguments. I have 2 slides from the feminist performance artist Mira Latterman-Euclid and her maintenance art. And she wrote this now famous Care Manifesto in the 60s and started working on this maintenance art during the period. And I see her work embracing, she was involved in public projects and public budgeting and sort of embracing money as an abstract public utility, and then realizing, actualizing it along working class feminist lines. So that's the reason for that. And then what's the status of the canon? Well, so I'm arguing that Renaissance perspective is the birth of a visual repression of abstraction, and the canon traces that. And I would say that it doesn't stay stable, it changes over time. So whereas Florentine painting in the early and sort of middle Renaissance is trying to give us a stable gravitropic visuality. Whereas by the time you get to Mannerism and Baroque and the Northern painting as well, you get an increasingly kind of unstable, disintegrated gravitropism. But I would argue that those gravitropic impulses are actually there from the beginning. They're just kept in check. And I don't think there's any accident that you see political, economic, and ecological turmoil at the very same time as that visual gravitropic visuality starts to feel less and less stable. And my argument is that gravity becomes the caretaker. Gravity becomes the largest macro caretaker that this emergent modernity can imagine, and can imagine in the visual sphere, at least along this historical line. There's always exceptions. And then, so with the Picasso, I'm doing 2 things. One thing I'm doing is I'm interested in modernism, and I'm interested in the ways that modernism and the avant-garde, the historical avant-garde, and later, they just don't truck with, they don't truck with Florentine perspective at all. So this is a question for me I still don't really have a great answer for, is what's the difference between, let's say, this more Thomistic Gothic visual abstraction versus Rock and Picasso and European visual modernism. But I tend to think that there's something, according to my reading, there's more potential there, because they're at least trying to embrace abstraction. I do think that they're caught up in this problem of HGAD in a way that I would want to push. And then, right, then I just use it almost just for kind of suggestive content reasons, right? The woman with the child by the river. He did a whole series of these women and infants and children in his early career, and I find a lot of them evocative of the myth of Cura. So I just like to put that up next to. Yeah.
So the way in which you talk about money as a medium of care, I don't understand how you get the way you talk about it is as a potentiality, as a possibility, a contentless possibility, at least in terms of what you presented here. You started with particular contents in terms of Black Lives Matter and ecological concern. But I don't see how you get from this contentless possibility to a particular kind of contents of care. The content of care, like in Heidegger, is empty. You know, it's I don't understand how you move from one to the other.
So that's a great question. So one thing I will say is that I think that Marxism, and especially Marxism from Frankfurt School to to the present, I think that's a problem for them too. They have, especially this appeal to the Judaic ban on images, right? You don't name utopia because that's part of the positivist project that spoils utopia. It has to be this open, underdetermined historical labor, right? And I think what they would say is that it's precisely the labor, the collective labor of history that becomes the content. I would say that I have a related but different and more developed way of answering that question. So if money is not a private, finite exchange thing that passes around, there's an openness and a boundlessness which tells us we can afford it and we can demand big things. And we don't have to circulate finite money. Right? So that kind of opens the ceiling on utopia, on the question of the undetermined of the potential. But I would also say that because I put care, I think care is a thread throughout the Frankfurt School, and it's a thread throughout critical theory, but I don't think it's always the dominant one. Because I think power is the main question usually. And I think by putting care, by which I mean the historical structure of dependence, which includes visual culture, political institutions, it's not contentless. It's absolutely filled up. And I would say that this is maybe a better way of answering the first question, which is that's the status of my examples. My examples are who we are in the history of the development of the modern West. And our inheritance is this high-Newtonian blockbuster of these AAA video games, which, I think I read at one point, like, except for the lottery, people spend the most money on this kind of entertainment. Does that help, or?
Well, I don't agree. I mean, yes.
You don't agree?
I don't agree that. I mean, I agree that it's. find your argument about the limitlessness of the opening up of the potentiality, I find, that's plausible argument. The part that I don't agree with is the part that it's filled with content, that was filled with, that can go all different kinds of ways. And as it did for Heidegger, he ended up with releasement because, the evil that it led to. Out of care, we can derive lots of different possibilities.
Yeah, of course we can.
And but that's not very satisfying in the current moment.
So, I showed a picture of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez
Yes.
joining the Sunshine occupation of Nancy Pelosi's office yesterday, and they're calling for and not just climate action, but a public job guarantee, a public employment system which guarantees every resident in the United States a living wage public job, doing something in their community, and doing something in their community that serves public purposes, serves ecological purposes. So to me, that's the kind of imaginative possibility that I see, that framed politics, that has framed politics in America in the past. And the last time that happened was in the 60s and 70s, and there were movements for full employment, and a full employment bill passed and it was gutted by Carter. I grew up. I was born in 1978. I was born when the Humphrey Hawkins bill died, and that era was also based on those demands were based on this recycling money idea. You tax the wealthy to get the money to pay for these programs, and I think that, in addition to Jim Crow and many other reasons, but that zero-sum logic played a huge part in the failure of that moment. And so to me, there are radical possibilities. Of course it can go anywhere. Of course it can go.
Okay.
Yeah. And this is the thing, right? And this goes back to Heidegger too. That's the point. Care is not niceness. It's not mommy's taking care of babies. It's the constitutive problem. There's no going away from it. Other question?
A simple question of the, I think about, maybe you're alluding to critical theory, but one element that I guess for me is connected to a lot of things you're doing, but that you kind of abstracted is the issue of mediation and media. And I think about it because in some of your images, some of your examples, you have the trajectory of light and then the inversion through a certain media. And of course, I'm thinking about the German ideology of the camera obscura, and then that's a question of not only perspective but of light, and so it links a lot of the question of maybe some things that we don't see that are the kind of invisible work or the trajectory of life that are part of postmodern moment. You think about it, there's the modern moment of the Renaissance, but also the modern movement of industrialization, technology, etc. So one aspect for me when I'm looking at the evolution of your examples is that I see more and more that there's a kind of the abstraction that you allude to as many resonances. One of them is that you're abstracting kind of mediation. You're abstracting labor in a certain way, but you're also abstracting the history itself of money, that because in a certain way, when you look at money has become more and more abstract, right? The kind of money. But
I would disagree with that.
I understand that, but at the same time, you take money as it was at the time of Thomas and Thomas or Masaccio, and then you take what it is right now with the way we, with the Bitcoin or the different forms that money has taken through, the kind of liquidity that is linked to money. So there is that aspect of, there's a kind of ghost for me for your kind of engagement with critical theory and your criticism, the Marxist thinking about money, but at the same time, it seems to me that how can you do the economy of thinking about that if you want to have also an impact with a kind of Chartalist vision of care, Chartalist vision of money, and rethinking about our common project, as a society. That's one aspect where I don't see the logic of your itinerary. Because the current moment is predicating on the fact that money is cheap and that we are paying with what is not taken as income from those taxations that have disappeared more or less under Trump. We are paying with very cheap money, right?
What do you mean? Do you mean because interest rates are low?
Well, yeah. Well, so we don't see it right now. But the moment when interest rate could go just 1 point, it would mean a completely different social economy. So it's just, my question goes in many different directions with the way in which you went through different directions. But my question mainly is around the question of media. There's a kind of no mediation in a certain way because you have like two individuals, like, linking, being kind of attached. There's not like a third party or it's being abstract, it's being made invisible. So I kind of know.
Okay.
I mean, I'm lost in a lot of things that you said.
Yeah.
But the treatment of money, for me, I don't understand what you're doing with money. Here, maybe it's the Chartalist and the MMT that I don't understand. And also the question of, can we afford to really not think about mediation and media, too?
I think we cannot afford to not think about mediation.
Yeah.
That's a word that I use consistently in the book.
Which I read, so.
Yeah, that's fine. You don't have to read it.
Well, yeah.
So everything that I was saying about abstraction was essentially an argument about mediation. And what I was trying to do rather quickly when I was talking about the cash nexus is the way that Marxism begins, when Marxism is beginning to think about mediation, I used this expression. It's thought in terms of immediate mediation. It's what Hegel would call concrete universality. Whereas, from the Chartalist point of view, money doesn't work that way. And I would argue that mediation doesn't work that way. Mediation begins with broad-scale dependence. It doesn't begin in the cash nexus. It begins with a relationship between the centralized institution upon which everybody variously depends and everybody else. And that's where it starts. So how do we get me here? Well, both the federal and the state that I live in, the state of Florida, they both tax. Florida doesn't tax all that much. They both tax. I owe them. I pay sales tax. I have so many obligations. I pay income tax. I need to go to work to make money to participate in this society. It socializes my labor. It socializes many people's labor. Not enough people's labor, but it socializes labor in a macro sense. Then, Bhaskar recommends me for this talk, and then you do some work, and papers are pushed around, and then suddenly we've bought a plane ticket, and you've moved me over here. Right? But my Chartalist position would be that you can't wish away these overriding tax obligations, these overriding relationships, the payment system, as screwed up as it is, the structure of the treasury and the financial sector, as screwed up as they are not contingent circumstantial. That doesn't mean they have to be here forever, but they're not contingent circumstantial, and they all play a part in why I'm here. So for me, mediation, this is why Thomas's cascade of being, of mediation, appeals to me so much, because it's the last time, at least in the Western tradition, or what we call the Western tradition, in which that kind of breadth, that kind of width, that kind of all-at-onceness was taken seriously. So mediation is so important for me. Go ahead.
So how does object relations theory figure for you? You mentioned that.
Yeah.
You didn't talk about it, but
Yeah.
I can't imagine how to.
Right, because object relation, everything I'm doing is trying to get away from object
Yes, so-
relations, right? Or situate object relations in a cascade. That's a wonderful question. So, object relations, starting in late Freud, and then things that the object relations that Klein and others take up. And I'm especially interested in Winnicott and also this guy Thomas Ogden, who's much more recent. I've long been interested in the way that they think about symptomology. And they think about symptomology not primarily as an edible conflict where you repress the things that the baby wants to do, and then you have the compromise formation, which is essentially an expression of a battle. It's an expression of a conflict of power between classically boy and daddy, right? And boy and paternal law. And I've always thought, not always, but as dependence and care became increasingly important for my thinking, I realized the way that object relations is always often thinking about symptomology not as a battle between the child and the father, but as a failure or problem or enigma of the caretaking environment. And at its worst, it's like mommy, in the most patriarchal frame. But as we all do now, psychoanalysis can take us all the way up to the macro level. And that's what I'm doing with it. So I want to read symptoms not as, sure, I can read symptoms as edible expressions of power conflict, but I'm more interested, because of this positive content, this historical content that I want, I'm more interested in bringing out the repressed problems of dependence and care, and you can't just do that immediately. It's not transparent. You have to read cultural objects in order to find the signs of those interdependencies that, especially in we're Lockean cowboys in America. We repress all those.
So you're saying that what you like about what I'm hearing, what draws you to object relations theory is its interest in the holding environment.
Exactly.
Okay, so just bear with me for a minute. I think I could say a lot about that, but it does sort of translate problems of integration, individual and social, into a kind of network of relations that babies fail to interject, that caregivers themselves don't feel a part of, etc. So I can imagine it's a kind of network almost. So now, I didn't understand many parts of your talk, but what I keep thinking about is then if these environmental factors where abstraction really needs to be certified and affirmed in a way to get away from a kind of, what do you call it?
Pitchy.
Yeah.
Business.
Yeah. And I hate to ask this question, but I have to. And I don't even know how to frame it. And I've never been asked this question this way, but another part of the Frankfurt School is also analysis of this. Then bodies get cared for in a certain way through abstraction. I mean, in other words, where does pain figure into this? Or where does suffering? I mean, dependence is different than suffering, and the abstraction. Yeah,
so what I would say is that suffering is always already social. So suffering is a sign of a inextricable dependence. That's the easy way of answering the question. Let me see what I can do with the concentration.
I mean, just in terms of abstraction, this is the problem with abstracted bodies.
Right. So Zygmunt Beuys makes the argument that abstraction caused the Holocaust. Right? And that's a kind of flat, maybe ridiculous proclamation, but I think it's one that a lot of people hold. And I would argue for many reasons why that's not the case. And I would actually argue that it's the opposite. And we can start with the Weimar Republic. In the Weimar Republic, there was an economist who was a Bolshevik who was living in Germany. His last name was Wojtyński. I can't remember what his first name was. Maybe Vladimir. It's called Vladimir Wojtyński. And essentially, he had come through his own researches, his own thinking. He had come to a conception of money that's very reminiscent of MMT today. This is a thinking that comes and then represses. It comes back up and it's repressed. So MMT is just the latest. And after the hyperinflation, after it was relatively stabilized with the Dawes plan, there was contraction. There was economic contraction. There was still mass unemployment, mass suffering. And the Social Democratic Party, with the Marxist Hilferding as their advisor, got into a debate with Wojtyński about what is to be done. Wojtyński said, let's just directly produce credit because we're the government and create a public employment program and put everybody to work. And Hilferding said, no way, that's not how capitalism works, because that's not what Marx says about how capitalism works. We must let the crisis play itself out. So my argument would be, without being an absolute expert on the period, my argument would be that ignoring and contracting our sense of abstraction is what gets us to fascism and the concentration camp. And it's Hitler who was fledgling for a while. He had the Nazis had a good run in the beginning, but then they were fledgling, as I understand it. But things got worse and worse, and they, as we all know, right? They kept using scapegoating logics. And what did they do? They promised to employ people, and they didn't just employ Jews and murder them in a genocidal act. Some of my own family was part of that. They also employed the German population. And that's one of the reasons why they were so successful. I mean, the standard kind of Marxist argument is to say that they were successful because they got big business behind them. And of course that's true. But they got support of the people because they were unemployed and they wanted work. And the Nazis put the finger on the printing press and made jobs. So my argument would be that is a violent symptom of a repression of monetary abstraction and a violent symptom of radical carelessness. I don't think you go from any kind of minimal security to the camps just because there's a printing press. I think, and I don't think I'm alone in this, I think fascism, right, it's not just about mean people who want power. It's about crisis situations. in which certain political parties and demagogic figures create scapegoats. And what is a scapegoat? To me, the scapegoat is the logic of Hitchhiking. It says, look, there really isn't enough for everyone to go around. So let's bundle together, physically bundle together in the strong fascist bundle. And of course people are going to have to be excluded. And I would argue that fascism is actually, other people have argued this also in a different way, it's liberalism's deadly underbelly. Because what liberalism does is it says, like, yeah, we can't really afford it for everybody. Like, people are going to be excluded. But we're going to say nice things about equality and everybody has an opportunity. Hillary Clinton in the last election. Everybody should have an opportunity to succeed. They might not succeed. So what I think fascism does is it just plays out the Hitchhiking logics of liberal money and liberal modernity that they want to keep at bay. It's like, yeah, right. There's only the elect, and they come from our blood and soil, and everybody else push them to the side. So to me, attending to abstraction, attending to the holistic nature of interdependence is precisely the opposite of fascism. Austerity, fascism, becomes.
Should we, one more question and then we'll. Yeah.
You want? No, no, no. I'm not going to let's get started.
Okay.
Well, this is I have a lot of questions, but I'm going to ask you a quick one, or not, and that is, it actually goes back to previous question a little bit, but the illustrations here and how you're using them in the book. What is the power and agency of aesthetic practice in this model? Is it just simply an illustration or a symptom of other forces, or is it in fact a productive intervention, potentially a productive intervention in the models you're describing?
It's definitely not a mere illustration, so not that. It's also not a mere symptom. It is symptoms are crazy. Symptoms are productive. So symptoms, it might be symptomatic often, depending on what I'm reading. The gravitropic visuality that I'm reading is highly symptomatic. The feminist performance maintenance art is highly productive of the mobilization of abstraction, of budgeting, of money creation for collective maintenance and care. I also spent some time in the last chapter talking about mid-century modernism, and I suggest that there's no accident that despite its racist, sexist, patriarchal, homophobic problems, mid-century United States was a comparatively robust, thriving economy compared to what starts to happen in what we now call the neoliberal period from the 70s to the present. And I think it's not an accident that so much of visual material culture and beyond architecture, which is part of both visual and material culture, is just emphatically embracing abstraction. The story that gets told is that the sort of anti-bourgeois, radical modernist and avant-gardist impulses get commercialized and become part of the mass commercial culture, military-industrial complex of the mid-century United States. And while I wouldn't want to send us back there, I think it's a moment when our visual and material culture was embracing abstraction at a phenomenological and unconscious level, and that's a good thing. And that we need to be doing that more. And the way I read the neoliberal period is, it's not that everything becomes gravitropic. It's that primarily these blockbusters in the AAA video games become gravitropic. But mid-century modernism is still here, right? Johnny Ive and Mac design, and we still love our abstractions. You know, look at my phone, like look at all the crazy stuff, animation that goes on, you know, on my graphic user interfaces. We love abstraction, but we're terrified of it. And my argument is that the reason why the new Hollywood blockbuster, this hyper-Newtonian media form, is so symptomatic is because it shows us our own intense ambivalence to various forms of abstract mediation, from money to technology to the visual field and stuff. So I wouldn't say that we repress abstraction as a whole, but I would say we have serious problems with it. And it's curious that at the moment we officially go off the gold standard in the 70s, that there's a long history of populist, greenbackers, populist party, bimetallist movements who were saying like, yeah, you know, the amount of money that's available is political and we can actually change it. And we had people running for office and president who were saying, you know, we can have more money. We don't have to have a gold standard. We won the Civil War because we printed greenbacks like mad and put soldiers to work and to death. So I think it's curious that in the 70s, when we finally go off the gold standard, the question of money structure and mediation is just not politicized. The lingering civil rights movement and the battle for the Humphrey Hopkins Full Employment Act is not coupled with a populist, or whatever you want to call it. Populism is such a screwed up word now. But it's not coupled with a radical monetary politics. So I think it's that moment kind of seals this sort of reduction of money to an abstraction, but that sort of behaves like a thisness, that there's only a finite amount of, and it starts circulating around the globe, and different countries want to gobble it up for themselves, but oh, too bad, because companies and financiers are sending, you know, jobs and investments and financial instruments overseas. So here I'm just riffing, but yeah.
Last question.
Okay. Care for whom? I was wondering about that.
Yeah.
When you said in the 50s there was some sense of care in here, you know, US.
Yeah.
I immediately thought that was only made possible by all the peaking of American imperialism at that point.
Yeah.
So care for whom? And
Absolutely.
in this do, you know, animals and protozoa and minerals and things in new ways.
Right. And viruses that.
Yeah, figure.
Yeah. Okay. So, so to go back to the Heidegger, right? Care is not an option. It's just what it is. It's just the problem. And then the problem is precisely the how of care and the who. And I would argue that right, when somebody, you know, we're housing millions of people in public and private prisons now. We're taking care of them, just like the Nazis took care of Jews and Gypsies, etc. So care is always happening. So it's the question of the what?
I know this is analogies, I just keep going.
The question is, what is the quality of care? Yes, the imperial project is a problem. I am not at all, you know, history sucks. I'm using what's available. So I'm not trying to save, you know, the racist mid-century imperialist project whole hog. Just like I'm not trying to save, you know, the Catholic Church whole hog.
Okay, let's bracket the 50s and all of that.
Do you want to talk about imperialism?
Yes, no. My real question is, what is the relationship for you between care and commons? Because it seems to me, if care is there, commons is there too.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Like that's the...
I do. That's a good question. So, commons, for a number of reasons that are all traceable back to Duns Scotus and those Franciscans, commons are often either explicitly or implicitly thought of as being somehow pre-political. There's a commons, and then the government can, either allow or disallow this commons. So from a chartalist point of view, the commons, right, are always provisioned. They're always provisioned. So they're always caught up in the problem of governance, and they're always caught up in the problem of care. That's what I would say. And the commons are variously abundant, as I think most people who are interested in the commons know. But what we don't know is that the centralizing, mediating infrastructure, money, we don't think that's abundant. We presume that it is a finite, decentralized thing that everybody's chasing after and hemorrhaging. In the latest Steven Spielberg film, what's it called? Ready Player One. They literally hemorrhage coin. It's really good for my project.
Scott, thank you.
Thank you.